I've loved your sister for 8 years. I slapped my fiancé, then married a Mafia boss. Tristan Fairmont stood at the head of the dinner table with a champagne glass in his hand and confession dripping from his mouth like something he'd been holding back so long it had curdled. I've been in love with Corinne for 8 years. The room went silent, the way rooms only go silent when something irreversible has just happened. Belle felt the words land in her chest before her brain processed them. 6 years. She had given this man 6 years of her life. She had rearranged her dreams around his schedule, defended him to her mother, worn his ring for 14 months. And he had spent every single one of those years loving her sister. Her hand moved before she decided to move it. The slap echoed off the walls of the Fairmont family dining room. Then she pulled the ring from her finger and threw it directly at his face. Splitting. If someone had told you the worst night of your life would eventually lead you to the one person who would change everything, would you have believed them? Stay with me until the end of this story. If it moves you, hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The engagement dinner had been Tristan's mother's idea. Vivian Fairmont had opinions about everything: the centerpieces, the seating arrangement, the temperature of the white wine, and she had opinions about Belle Winslow that she had never quite managed to disguise as warmth. Vivian came from the kind of old Boston money that treated beauty as an obligation and size as a moral failing, and she had spent 6 years being politely bewildered that her son had chosen a woman who didn't fit the Fairmont aesthetic. Belle knew this. She had always known this. She had come to the dinner anyway, in a deep burgundy dress she'd designed herself, with her dark hair pinned back and her grandmother's pearl earrings at her ears, because that was what you did when you were Maribel Winslow. You showed up. You held your chin level. You refused to give anyone the satisfactions of seeing you flinch. She was 33 years old, and she had spent most of those years showing up for people who counted on her doing exactly that. The Fairmont house sat on Beacon Hill, 4 stories of federal period brick with a garden that Vivienne kept immaculate and a dining room that could seat 20 people in formal discomfort. Both families had been invited. Belle's mother, Patricia, had driven up from Providence in her good coat. A soundman. Her younger sister, Corinne, had taken the train from Cambridge, where she was finishing her graduate degree in environmental law, and arrived 40 minutes late, because Corinne was always 40 minutes late to everything. Belle had watched Tristan's eyes find Corinne the second she walked into the room. Watched it, and she had felt the familiar knot in her stomach, the one she'd been explaining for years, and she had decided, as she always decided, that she was imagining things, that she was insecure, that this was exactly what Tristan said it was, her tendency to invent threats that didn't exist. He had told her that so many times she had started to believe it was her factory setting. The dinner began well enough. Patricia talked about her garden. Vivian talked about the Fairmonts' summer house in Maine. Tristan's older brother Garrett argued mildly with his wife about something real estate adjacent. Belle sat beside Tristan and drank her wine and answered questions and smiled at the right moments, which was a skill she had refined to the point that nobody could tell it was work. Then Tristan stood up. He had been drinking since cocktail hour. Belle had noticed she always noticed, but Tristan held his alcohol like a man who had practice, and she'd assumed he was nervous about the formal toast, which was supposed to involve a brief speech about the engagement and possibly some mild embarrassment about how they'd met. He tapped his glass. Everyone looked at him. And Tristan Fairmont, 4th-generation Boston real estate developer, man who owned 2 boats and a membership at a club Belle had never been invited to join, opened his mouth and said the thing that destroyed 6 years in under 30 seconds. I need to say something. And I've been holding this back long enough that I think it's killing me a little bit. I've been in love with Corinne since the night I met her, 8 years ago, before Belle and I ever started dating. I thought it would go away. He set the champagne glass down with the careful precision of a very drunk man trying to appear sober. It didn't. Belle's mother made a sound. Garrett's fork hit his plate. Corinne, who had been reaching for the bread basket, went absolutely still. Belle sat with her wine glass halfway to her mouth. Her first thought was not rage. That came later. Her first thought was something closer to the sensation of stepping off a curb you didn't know. Was there that lurch of air where solid ground was supposed to be? She set the glass down very carefully. Then why did you ask me? She said it quietly. She didn't mean to say it quietly, but her voice had apparently decided that quiet was where it lived now. Tristan looked at her, and the expression on his face, the particular mixture of relief and guilt, and something that was almost resentment, as if Belle were the inconvenient obstacle to his honesty, rather than the woman he had proposed, told her everything she needed to know about the last 6 years, before he even answered. Because Corinne didn't want me, he said. I asked her. Early on, she said no, and eventually I thought maybe I could, that maybe with you I could. Stop, Belle said. He stopped. She needed him to stop because she was suddenly doing very rapid math in her head. 6 years. Every time she had felt uneasy about how he looked at Corinne at family events, he had called it jealousy. Every time she had confided that she sometimes felt invisible beside her younger sister smaller. Somehow, despite being the larger woman in the room, he had agreed just enough to validate the fear before pivoting to reassurance. Every argument that had ended with Belle apologizing for being insecure. Every moment she had spent questioning her own instincts rather than questioning him. She had thought her body was the problem. He had known it was him. And he had let her believe otherwise. She stood up. She didn't plan the slap. It arrived the way some things arrive. Complete, necessary, from somewhere below deliberate thought. Her open palm connected with his cheek hard enough to turn his head, and the sound of it in that dining room was the loudest thing Belle had heard in years. The ring came next. She worked it off her finger with the focused efficiency of a woman completing a task, and she threw it at him. Not gently. It hit him in the chest and bounced somewhere toward the centerpiece, and Belle did not watch where it landed because she was already looking for her coat. Belle, Tristan started. Don't, Corinne was on her feet. Belle felt her sister's hand on her arm before she saw her, and she turned half expecting. She didn't know what she expected. She was running on adrenaline and old wounds and something that felt like grief wearing rage as a disguise. But Corinne's face was not the face of a woman who had been conducting a secret. She looked horrified. She looked like someone who had just witnessed a car accident she hadn't seen, despite standing directly in the intersection. There was never anything, Corinne said. Belle, I need you to hear me. There has never been anything between us. Not once, not from my side, not ever. Belle looked at her sister. She believed her. That was the strangest part of the whole terrible evening, believing Corinne completely, instantly, without question. In the same moment, she was realizing that Tristan had spent years engineering a situation where she might not. I know, Belle said. She picked up her coat. She picked up her small evening bag. She looked briefly at her mother, who was pale and clutching her napkin, and clearly trying to decide whether to say something or allow the universe to continue collapsing on its own timeline. Don't, Belle told her mother as well, not unkindly. Then she walked out of the Fairmont dining room, through the foyer that smelled of cut flowers and old money, and into the cold Boston night. She drove herself home, because she had always driven herself. The studio was on the 3rd floor of a building in the South End, a neighborhood that had been industrial when she signed the lease and had since gentrified just enough to triple her rent without improving her parking situation. She lived above the workspace, which her mother had always said was asking for trouble, because you'd never stop working. Belle had decided early in her career that her mother was right about almost everything practical and almost nothing emotional, and this particular warning fell somewhere in between. She sat at her workbench for an hour without turning on the lights. She was not crying. She wanted to note that for the record, at least to herself, she was not crying, which surprised her, because Belle had always thought she was a crier. She cried at commercials. She cried at the last episode of television series she'd loved. She had cried at 3 separate weddings for people she barely knew. But sitting in her dark studio with the ring absent from her finger and 6 years of a relationship reclass itself in real time, she was dry-eyed, and she did not fully understand why. Later she would decide it was because she was in the presence of something she had not yet named, The feeling of finally being allowed to be right about something she had known for a long time. She had known, not about Corinne specifically, not the details, but the essential truth that something was wrong, that the distance she kept trying to bridge had a cause she was not being permitted to identify. She had known that. And Tristan had spent 6 years convincing her. The problem was her perception, rather than his character. She picked up a piece of silver wire and worked it between her fingers without building anything. Sometime around midnight, she realized she'd left her jewelry case at the Fairmont house. She called ahead in the morning, and one of Vivienne's staff confirmed the case had been found and set aside. Belle drove over, collected it in under 4 minutes, exchanged no meaningful words with anyone in the house, and left. She didn't notice until she was back at the studio that something had been placed beneath the case. A business card, plain stock, black text, no logo, no flourish. Ronan Blackthorne, Blackthorne Maritime and Holdings. A phone number, nothing else. Belle turned the card over. The back was blank. She had a vague memory of a man standing near the window during the part of the evening, before everything collapsed. Dark hair, expensive suit, particular stillness of someone who was not making small talk because they had decided they didn't need to. He had not been part of either family group. He had been someone's guest or someone's obligation, and she had noticed him the way you notice someone who takes up space differently than other people do. And then the evening had detonated, and she had stopped noticing anything except the exit. She put the card on her workbench. She did not call. She had enough to deal with. The week after the dinner was a specific kind of hell that Belle had not anticipated. She had anticipated heartbreak. She had anticipated anger. She had anticipated the humiliation of having to explain to people what had happened, the condensed, controlled version she gave to clients, and the longer version she gave to Corinne over the phone at 11 at night, talking until her voice gave out. What she had not anticipated was the way the story rearranged itself when she looked at it fresh. She found herself sitting on her bathroom floor at 7 in the morning before a client meeting, trying to identify a single argument in the last 3 years that had not ended with her apologizing. She was trying to identify one time she had expressed discomfort about Corinne and Tristan and been taken seriously instead of gently corrected. She couldn't find one, and what disturbed her more than the specific incidents was the pattern the way Tristan had learned to locate her existing insecurities and then position himself as the solution to them, so that questioning him felt identical to confirming everything she feared about herself. She was the largest woman in most rooms she entered. She had made peace with that incrementally over years. But Tristan had been quietly unmaking that peace the entire time, in ways so small and so plausibly deniable that she had never been able to name them while they were happening. A look, a silence at the wrong moment, a compliment that contained a comparison. She had thought she was fragile. He had needed her to think that. She was in the middle of this reconstruction, so her studio buzzer went off. She wasn't expecting anyone. She almost didn't answer. The man at the bottom of the stairs was the man from the window. He was taller than she'd registered. He was wearing a dark coat, and he was holding, with a kind of careful neutrality, a velvet box about the size of a deck of cards. "Ms. Winslow," he said, "I apologize for the unannounced visit. My name is Ronan Blackthorne." Belle looked at him. "I know your name," she said. "You left a card, I did." "I didn't call, no." He did not seem particularly troubled by this. "I came anyway. I have something that belongs to you. Technically, it belongs to me, but it's yours because of what you did with it." Belle's professional instincts overrode her wariness, the way they usually did when something unusual arrived in her vicinity. "Come up," she said. He set the velvet box on her workbench and stepped back. She opened it. Inside was a silver pendant, an olive branch worked in fine-gauge wire, curling around a small oval stone of deep blue, slightly uneven, clearly hand-polished. The work was old, maybe 15 years, maybe more. Belle knew the moment she saw it, not because she remembered the piece specifically, she had repaired hundreds of pieces. But she remembered the category, the repairs she had done quietly, in the early years of her practice, for people who could not afford to pay her standard rate. She had kept a separate drawer then, a small box of jobs she had taken, because the piece mattered to someone, and the money wasn't the point. The pendant had a particular quality of having been loved. The clasp showed wear at the hinge that came from someone opening and closing it many times over many years. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "My mother," Ronan Blackthorne said. "Margaret Blackthorne. She brought it to you in 2016. She couldn't afford the repair. You fixed it anyway and refused her money." Belle looked at the pendant in her hand. Then she looked at him. "Told you that?" "Many times." His voice was very even. "She described you as the young woman at the jewelry studio in the South End who fixed her necklace and wouldn't let her pay, and then acted like it was nothing." Belle did not remember Margaret Blackthorne specifically. She remembered a woman in her late 60s with hands that shook slightly and a coat that had been expensive once. She remembered the pendant had a sprung clasp and a hairline fracture in the wire mount that had taken 2 hours to address properly. She remembered refusing the money because the woman had counted it out from a small envelope, and the counting had taken a long time. She passed 2 years after that, Ronan said. 2018. Belle set the pendant back in its box. Something was pressing against the inside of her chest. "I'm sorry," she said. She kept talking about the jewelry girl. He said it without sentiment, like a man reporting facts. "Long after that visit, she said you handled the piece like it mattered." Belle didn't say anything. "I wanted to find you," Ronan continued. "At the time it wasn't. I had other things to manage. Her illness, her estate. The pendant stayed in a drawer. Then I saw your maker's mark at the Fairmont dinner. On the jewelry case you left behind. The crescent and the flame." Belle had designed that mark herself at 24 when she'd registered her business name. She hadn't thought about it as identifiable in the way he was describing. "I just wanted to return it," Ronan said, "and to tell you that she remembered your kindness until the end. I thought you should know that." He reached for the velvet box. Belle put her hand over it. Not to keep it, she wasn't sure what she was doing. The gesture arrived before the thought. "Did she wear it?" Belle asked. "After the repair, every day." Belle removed her hand and stepped back and looked at her workbench and thought about a woman she barely remembered who had apparently carried a piece of Belle's work against her skin every day for 2 years until she died. There was no way to respond to that felt adequate. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. Ronan Blackthorne nodded once. "Thank you for what you did for her." Then he picked up the box and walked back toward the stairs. He was halfway down when Belle called after him. "Miss Blackthorne." He stopped. "I didn't fix it because I expected anything," she said. I fixed it because it needed fixing, and she needed it. That's all." He looked up at her from the landing. "I know," he said. "That's why I came." And then he left. Belle stood in her studio for a long time after his footsteps faded, holding her own elbows, staring at the space where the velvet box had been. She had just had the strangest 10 minutes of what was already shaping up to be the strangest week of her life. A sound and for the first time since she had walked out of the Fairmont dining room, she had gone a full 10 minutes without thinking about Tristan. She thought about the pendant for 3 days. She thought about Margaret Blackthorne, who she could only partially reconstruct from a years-old memory, the shaking hands, the counted money, the coat. She thought about the fact that a woman she had barely registered had remembered her specifically and had kept telling the story and had apparently told it to a son who had looked at a jewelry case across a crowded room years later and recognized a small handmade mark. She thought, uncomfortably, about what it meant that a stranger's dead mother had known Belle's work well enough to describe it, while the man she'd been engaged to had never once asked what the crescent and flame represented or why she'd chosen it. She was still thinking about all of this when Ronan Blackthorne returned to her studio 4 days after his first visit. This time he called ahead. He arrived with a folder instead of a velvet box. Sat down in the chair across from her workbench, the chair where clients sat when they were describing what they wanted, and he opened the folder and he laid out a professional commission proposal with the precision of someone who had done this many times and expected it to be accepted. The Margaret Blackthorne Foundation was preparing a limited collection. 12 pieces, honoring women who had rebuilt their lives after displacement, hardship, and loss. They wanted original design work, not production pieces. They wanted someone who understood that jewelry carried memory. He named a fee that made Belle's hands go very still in her lap. "Why me?" she said. "Because my mother trusted your hands with something irreplaceable." Belle looked at the proposal. "This is not charity," she said. "No. You're not doing this because you feel you owe me something." "No. Though I respect that you need to ask." She picked up the proposal and began reading it properly. From the first page, the way she had trained herself to read everything since the first year of running her own business. When a poorly read contract had cost her 3 months of work and a relationship with a client she'd liked. She read every clause. She found the one she objected to almost immediately. 18 months of exclusivity is too long, she said without looking up. "I'll accept 9. There was a brief pause. 9, Ronan agreed. She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't categorize, not quite surprise, not quite amusement. Something that was paying attention. "I'll need full creative control," she said. "Your foundation can approve the conceptual direction. The execution is mine." "Agreed. And I'll need access to your foundation director." "Not through intermediaries. I'll arrange it." Belle looked back at the proposal. She was aware, in a way she couldn't completely suppress, that she was negotiating with a man who apparently one of the most powerful private business empires on the East Coast, and that he was agreeing to everything she said. Not grudgingly, not with the slightly insulted patience of someone tolerating a difficult supplier. With what appeared to be genuine attention, as if her counterpoints were information he was actually absorbing. Tristan had never once asked her what she wanted from a contract. He had always assumed she would agree to whatever was offered, because that was the path of least resistance, and Belle had spent 6 years being the path of least resistance for him. "I trusted the wrong man for 6 years," she said, and she wasn't sure why she said it out loud, except that it was the truest explanation for why she was reading every line of every document he had put in front of her. "I read everything now." Ronan Blackthorne looked at her for a moment. "Good," he said. "Just that, good." Belle turned back to the proposal. She signed it 20 minutes later, after she had changed 2 more clauses, and he had agreed to both, without visible hesitation. She did not examine what she felt as he left. She told herself it was professional satisfaction. She was not entirely convinced. Outside the window, the Boston afternoon moved through its ordinary business, indifferent to the fact that something had shifted in a small South End studio, quiet as a hinge turning, small as a handshake, but real. Belle picked up a piece of silver wire and started working. For the first time in 8 days, her hands were completely steady. The first week of the commission was purely transactional. Belle dealt with the foundation's director, a brisk woman named Sandra Okafor, who had opinions about everything and the professional authority to back most of them up. They met twice in a conference room at Blackthorn Maritime Seaport Office, a building that looked, from the outside, exactly like what it was supposed to be, the headquarters of a successful private maritime and logistics company. Glass, steel, a lobby with a security desk where they checked your name against a list before letting you past. Belle had been in corporate offices before. She had done commissions for wealth management firms, tech companies, a hospital system that wanted custom pieces for a fundraising gala. She knew how to navigate rooms where the furniture was expensive and the air felt pressurized. What she had not experienced before was the particular atmosphere of a Blackthorn building. She noticed it the second time she came, after she had stopped being distracted by the logistics of the meeting itself. It's the way people moved in the corridors when Ronan Blackthorne passed through them. Not the performative deference of employees trying to look busy for the boss. Something quieter. Something that started in the spine before it reached the face. A slight recalibration of posture. A drop in conversational volume that happened without anyone's deciding to be quieter. She noticed it because she was a woman who had spent years reading rooms, and because she had trained herself, after Tristan, to pay attention to the things she used to explain away. Ronan moved through his own building. The waiter moved through his own water, through a channel it had cut itself without effort, without announcement, without any apparent awareness that he was the reason. Everyone around him was slightly more alert. He appeared at the second meeting for the last 20 minutes, sat at the far end of the table, and said almost nothing. He asked one question about the provenance of the stone sources Belle had proposed. He listened to her answer. He nodded once. He left before Sandra had finished wrapping up. Belle watched him go and thought, that man has never once in his life needed to raise his voice. It was not an admiring thought, exactly. It was an observational one. She was still separating those two things in her mind when she got back to her studio and found 24 white roses on her workbench with a card from Tristan. She left them on the bench untouched until they started dropping petals, then put them directly in the trash. Tristan called. She let it go to voicemail. He called again. She listened to the voicemail while eating toast over her kitchen sink. His voice had that particular quality she now recognized as performance, the measured sincerity of a man who had rehearsed it just enough to sound unrehearsed. He was sorry he had handled things terribly. He needed her to understand that what he'd felt for Corinne had been something he'd tried to kill for years, and that his feelings for Belle had been real. Different, but real. Belle ate her toast. She was aware that 6 months ago, that voicemail would have wrecked her. The ambiguity of it, the careful positioning of Corinne as something that had happened to him, a condition he'd suffered, rather than a choice he'd made and hidden. Now she mostly noticed the architecture of it, the way every sentence was structured, so that she was the woman who had to decide whether to believe him, and the burden of his redemption sat squarely in her hands. She deleted the voicemail. She texted Corinne, "He's calling me." Corinne responded in under a minute. "He called me too." Told him to stop then. "Are you okay? Then don't answer that." Stupid question. "Are you functional?" Belle smiled at her phone for the first time in 2 weeks. "Functional," she typed back. "Working on a big commission." "Talk this weekend." She put her phone face down and picked up her sketchbook. She had 12 pieces to design for women who had rebuilt from nothing, and she was not going to let Tristan Fairmont occupy the square footage in her brain that she needed for that work. The designs came slowly at first, then all at once the way they always did when she stopped forcing them. She researched the women the foundation had profiled. She read their stories. A woman from Haiti who had rebuilt a business after losing everything in the 2010 earthquake. A woman from Detroit who had rebuilt her family's finances after her husband's death, left them with debt she hadn't known existed. A Vietnamese-American woman who had rebuilt her sense of self after leaving a marriage that had dismantled her piece by piece. That last one stopped Belle at her workbench for a long time. She sketched without thinking about what she was making, and when she looked down at the paper, she had drawn a pendant that looked almost like a door opening, or possibly a door that had just been walked through, the angle ambiguous by design. She photographed it, sent it to Sandra, and got a response in 4 minutes. This is exactly what we need. Can you come in tomorrow?" Belle was at the Seaport office by 9. Ronan was there when she arrived. Not in the meeting room, she passed him in the corridor outside, where he was speaking in a low voice to a man in his 50s, who had the compressed, watchful quality of someone whose actual job title would not appear on any official company document. Conversation stopped when Belle came around the corner. The other man's eyes did a rapid, professional assessment that lasted less than a second and told her he had categorized her, calculated her relevance, and filed her simultaneously. Ronan turned, and something in his posture shifted not much, not dramatically, but enough that Belle caught it the way she caught the dropped volume in the corridors. "Ms. Winslow." He stepped slightly away from the other man. "The meeting's not until 9:30. Sandra's assistant can show you to." "I know where the meeting room is," Belle said. "I was going to look at your lobby cases. I noticed last time you have some antique maritime pieces in the display. I wanted to look at the joinery." Ronan looked at her for a moment. "Room 3, he said. "On your left past the cases." "Thank you." She walked past both men. She did not look back, but she heard nothing behind her until she had turned the corner, which meant they had also stopped talking, and she wasn't sure what that meant and decided not to care. The meeting with Sandra lasted 90 minutes and produced a working agreement on 7 of the 12 design concepts. Belle left with a clearer project brief and a new deadline that was aggressive but achievable if she spent the next 6 weeks doing almost nothing else. She was in the elevator when Ronan stepped in beside her. He had clearly been going somewhere else. He pressed the lobby button, which was already lit. They rode down in silence for a floor. "The door piece," he said. "The pendant you sent Sandra." "The threshold piece," Belle said. "I haven't named it yet." "The woman, it's for the one from the foundation profile." "She was my mother's age." Belle looked at him. "I didn't know that," she said. "She lost her husband the same year my mother got sick. They were connected through a women's center in Dorchester." He was looking at the elevator doors. "My mother talked about her." Belle considered this. The elevator reached the lobby. Neither of them moved immediately. "Did your mother know the foundation would do this?" Belle asked. "The collection? It wasn't established until after she died. It was what I could think to do with the money I had and the guilt I had about not being around enough when she was ill." He said it the way people say things that are true and uncomfortable and have been carried quietly for a long time. She would have had opinions about every piece. Would she have liked the threshold one? He thought about it. Actually thought about it, which meant the answer wasn't quick. She'd have wanted to know what the woman felt like. "Walking through the door," he said finally. "Not the door, the feeling." Belle looked at the elevator doors. "That's a better brief than anything Sandra gave me," she said. Something happened in his expression that was not quite a smile. Closer to an internal adjustment. Like something that had been held carefully for a long time had shifted slightly. The elevator doors opened. They walked out. The weeks that followed established a rhythm Belle hadn't anticipated. She came to the Seaport office twice a week. Sandra was efficient and decisive, and occasionally too focused on the gala presentation of the pieces over the emotional content of them, and Belle pushed back on this repeatedly and without apology. The third time, she overruled a suggested design modification on the grounds that it would make the piece prettier but emptier. Ronan happened to be passing the open meeting room door. Sandra glanced toward him, automatically, the way people glanced toward him when they needed something settled. He looked at Belle's sketch, then at Sandra's suggested modification. Then he kept walking. "Her collection," he said, from the corridor, without slowing down. "Her decision." Sandra's jaw tightened fractionally. "Toe." Belle kept her face neutral, but something warm and specific moved through her chest that she immediately filed under professional satisfaction and refused to examine further. She started noticing small things. Ronan drank espresso without sugar and held the cup like someone who had learned coffee in a place that took it seriously. He was never late to anything. It's like greenwood splitting. He despised meetings that should have been emails and had a particular kind of silence, the silence of a man deciding whether to say what he was thinking, that was different from the silence of a man who had nothing to think. He asked her questions she hadn't expected. Not about the jewelry. About the women. About what drew her to the threshold design over the others she'd sketched. About whether she thought beauty could carry grief, or whether it always transformed it into something more palatable. Both, she'd said, over bad coffee from the break room, which was the only kind available at the Seaport office, despite the fact that Blackthorn Maritime was worth more than some small nations. Depends on whether you're making the piece for the grief or for what comes after it. How do you know which one you're making? I don't always. Sometimes the piece tells me. He had looked at her the way he looked at things he was filing away. She noticed that he laughed rarely and quietly, not a performed laugh, not a social one, just a sudden brief acknowledgement that something had landed. She noticed it 3 times over those weeks, twice in response to things she had said, and once in response to something he had read in a document that he did not share, and each time it surprised her because it was so clearly unguarded. Ronan Blackthorn, she was beginning to understand, was a man who had built an entire public architecture of control and quiet authority, and somewhere inside it was a person who felt things he had no particular infrastructure for. She was not supposed to find that interesting. She found it interesting. Corinne came to visit on a Saturday in late October. She brought She brought wine and the kind of energy that indicated she had been thinking about something for several days and had arrived at the point of needing to say it out loud. They sat splitting. They sat on the floor of Belle's studio, which was the most comfortable place in the building, during a long conversation because the heat came up through the floorboards, and it felt like sitting inside something that was alive. "Tell me about the commission," Corinne said. Belle told her. Corinne listened without interrupting, which was not her natural mode. She was a lawyer by training and disposition, and her default response to narrative was to identify the weak points in the argument. But she listened, and her expression cycled through several things. And when Belle finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You like him," Corinne said. "He's a professional contact."
Stop.
"That's not what I said, Corinne. You've been talking for 40 minutes, and you described his coffee habits." Belle opened her mouth, closed it. "He's complicated," she said finally. "Complicated how?" Belle turned her wine glass slowly in her hands. "He runs a legitimate business empire. The maritime and logistics side is real. I've done enough research to know it's substantial. But he's also stopped." "Also what?" "There are things I've noticed. The way people react to him. A man I saw him talking to in the corridor who looked like he had never in his life done anything that would appear in a quarterly report." She looked at her glass. "I'm not naive, Corinne." Corinne was quiet. "But he came to bring back your necklace," she said. "The one his mother loved. His mother's necklace." "Yes. And he agreed to every contract term you threw at him." "Yes. And he overruled his own foundation director in your favor." "It's not—" Belle stopped again. "It's not about any of that. It's about the fact that I spent 6 years with a man who used my insecurities as a management tool, and the last thing I need is to walk into another situation where I'm not seeing clearly, because I want to." Corinne looked at her older sister for a long moment. "The difference," she said carefully, "is that you're seeing him clearly. You're just also seeing something you didn't expect." Belle didn't answer. Outside, the October wind moved down the street and pressed briefly against the studio windows, and Belle sat with her wine and thought about a man who had laughed quietly 3 times in 4 weeks and never once assumed she would agree to anything. Tristan appeared on a Tuesday afternoon, which was his particular talent, showing up in the middle of things, at the wrong moment, in the wrong mood. Belle was in the middle of the fine work on the third piece, a collar of beaten silver, meant to suggest a shoreline, based on the profile of the woman from Detroit when the buzzer went. She almost didn't answer. She had a policy about unscheduled visits during studio hours. But something made her press the intercom button. It's Tristan. She should have sent him away. She told herself she was letting him up because she wanted to say what she needed to say face to face, and then she wouldn't have to say it again. He came up the stairs with his coat still on, and his hair slightly disordered from the wind, and his expression arranged into the particular settings she had once mistaken for passion, but now identified as strategic. Vulnerability, the face he made when he needed something. "You look good," he said, and the way he said it managed to sound simultaneously like a compliment and a small wound. "Don't," she said, not looking up from the workbench. "I'm not, he stopped. Started again. "I made a catastrophic mistake." "I know that. I'm not here to argue about it." "Then why are you here?" He sat in the client chair without being asked. Belle set down her tools. She waited. "I miss you," he said. "I miss having someone who the apartment is very quiet." "You destroyed our engagement in front of both families," she said. "And you did it because you were drunk enough, to be honest, for the first time in 6 years. The apartment being quiet is not my problem." "Belle, what do you actually want, Tristan?" The silence was 3 seconds too long. She had learned in 6 years to read his silences. This one had a specific texture, the silence of a man who had prepared a speech and was deciding whether the speech was still viable. "I need your help," he said. "Not with us. With something professional." Belle looked at him. She felt it happen, the specific compression in her chest that she now recognized as her body registering a truth before her brain articulated it. "Keep going," she said. "The waterfront project is in trouble. Serious trouble. The Blackthorn subsidiary that holds one of the critical approval licenses. I know you've been working with Ronan Blackthorn. A commission through his foundation. If you put in a word." Let him know that the project has merit, that— Stop. He stopped. You came here, said slowly, to ask me to use my professional relationship with a client to lobby for your business deal. It's not lobbying, it's just get out of my studio. Belle, the project represents 3 years of my life. And you just demonstrated, to my complete satisfaction, that you miss me the way you miss a useful tool. She stood up. She was aware that she was very calm. She was aware that the calmness was not suppressed anger. It was the specific calmness of a person who has finally understood something that needed understanding. You are not sorry for what you did to me. You are sorry that the thing you did to me has logistical consequences for your development project. That is the entire visit. I'd like you to leave. Tristan's face did something complicated. For one moment, she thought he might actually say something honest. Instead, he stood up and buttoned his coat and left. Belle stood in the middle of her studio. She breathed slowly. She picked up her tools. She began working again, and her hands were steady, and she did not cry. And she was not sure whether what she felt was grief or something more like the final click of a door closing properly for the first time. She told Ronan about the visit the next time she came to the Seaport office. Not because she needed his intervention or his protection or his opinion. She told him because the Foundation Commission and the Blackthorn subsidiary approval were connected, and he needed to know that someone had tried to use her as a channel between those two things. She laid it out cleanly in 4 sentences, while Sandra made copies in the other room. Roan listened without changing expression. He asked you to broker a financing conversation, he said. He asked me to put in a word. Yes, and you said. I threw him out. Ronan was quiet for a moment. The project is under risk review, he said. Independent of anything involving you. Blackthorn's committee flagged it 8 weeks ago. The projections don't hold. I'm not asking you to make any decision about it, Belle said. I'm telling you because transparency seemed appropriate. He looked at her for a moment. Tristan Fairmont is going to come back, Ronan said. When people are desperate, they return to the same wells. I know. If he becomes a problem, I'll handle it, Belle said. Something shifted in his expression, not displeasure. Something more like recalibration. He had been about to offer something assistance, intervention, the weight of his name applied to a situation, and she had declined it before he could, and he was adjusting to that. All right, he said. Sandra came back with the copies. They went back to work. The dinner with Everett Langley happened on a Thursday. Everett was an architect who had been a client of Belle's for 3 years. He commissioned custom pieces for his firm's major project completions, small sculptural objects that sat on desks or shelves, and suggested, without stating, that someone with taste had been involved. He was 36, with the kind of easy physical confidence that came from being tall and good-looking and knowing it without making it anyone else's problem. He had asked Belle to dinner twice before over the past 2 years. Both times she had declined, not because she wasn't attracted to him, she was, in a mild and manageable way, but because she had been engaged to Tristan, and she had believed in the engagement, which she now understood, said something both admirable and slightly heartbreaking about her nature. This time when Everett called and asked, she said yes. She said yes because she wanted to, because she was 33 years old, and she had just come out of the worst months of her life, and she was allowed to eat dinner with someone who looked at her like she was worth looking at. She told herself all of this very firmly on the way to the restaurant. It was a good dinner. Everett was funny and curious and listened when she talked about the commission without the particular masculine vagueness that signaled someone waiting for their turn to speak. He asked questions about the design process that were genuinely interested rather than politely dutiful. He refilled her wine glass at the right moment. He did not once make her feel like she was negotiating her own presence at the table. She came home and sat at her workbench and sketched for an hour and felt something light, cautiously optimistic about the general future. The Blackthorn Foundation gala planning meeting the following Monday involved Ronan in a way the previous meetings had not. He sat at the head of the table this time, with Sandra on one side and his chief communications officer on the other, because the gala had crossed a threshold of scale that required his direct attention. Belle was there to walk through the collection sequence and the display design and the display design. Ronan asked good questions, pointed questions, the kind that came from having actually read the materials in advance. He asked us about the sequencing of the pieces and whether the emotional arc of the display mirrored the arc of the women's stories. Halfway through the meeting, his communications officer mentioned that the gala guest list now included 2 journalists from major design publications and asked whether Belle was comfortable with press access. "Comfortable if I have final approval on how the pieces are described," Belle said. "That's unusual for a gala context. The women's stories are being told through these pieces. I designed around their specific experiences. The last thing I want is a journalist reducing it to an aesthetic trend piece without understanding what any of it means." She looked at the communications officer evenly. "So yes, I need approval on descriptions. That's the condition." The communications officer looked at Ronan. Ronan's expression said nothing. "Give her approval on descriptions," he said. After the meeting, when the room had mostly emptied, Ronan paused at the door. "Everett Langley," he said, without particular inflection. Belle looked up from gathering her sketches. "How was dinner?" The question was entirely neutral in tone. Everything else about the moment was not neutral. She considered him. "Nice," she said. Good, he was looking at the table. Then he looked at her, and the directness of it was the kind of directness that made the air in the room feel slightly rearranged. "He's a good architect," Ronan said. "Solid work." "Yes," Belle said. "He is." A pause. "I should have asked," Ronan said, "whether you were seeing anyone. Before the contract, it's relevant to—" He stopped. The stopping was more revealing than anything he had actually said. Belle set her sketches down. "Relevant to what?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. She watched him decide not to say the thing he had been about to say and replace it with something contained and professional. "The foundation event," he said. +1 logistics." "Ronan," he looked at her. She used his first name without planning to. It arrived the way the slap had arrived, from somewhere below the deliberate. "Say what you mean," she said. The silence between them was approximately 5 seconds long and contained more information than most conversations managed in an hour. "I don't know how to say it without it sounding like something it shouldn't sound like yet," he said finally. It was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. And it was also the moment she understood, with the particular clarity that came from having been lied to smoothly for 6 years, that whatever this was, this thing accumulating in the space between them, it was going to complicate everything that came next. She picked up her sketches. "Figure out how to say it," she said. "When you know." She left the building. Outside, the Boston November pressed down cold and immediate, and Belle walked to her car with her sketches under her arm. And she was thinking about the moment before the last one, the instant before he had stopped himself, and the fact that Ronan Blackthorne, who ran an empire on certainty, was standing somewhere behind her in a conference room, uncertain. That should not have mattered to her as much as it did. She drove home, telling herself it didn't. She did not believe herself. And 3 blocks from her studio, her phone rang. It was Tristan. She looked at his name on the screen. She did not answer. But she was also remembering, suddenly and unwillingly, the weight of his hand on her arm in every argument they'd ever had, the way he had always positioned himself between her and the door, a sound understanding, not for the first time, but with new sharpness, that the man she had agreed to marry had spent 6 years teaching her that her instincts were wrong, and that somewhere in the process she had learned to distrust them completely. She pulled over. She sat in the parked car with the phone dark in her hand. She thought about a man who had agreed to every contract term she threw at him and refused to overrule her decisions in front of his own staff, and said, plainly, that he did not know how to say what he meant without it, sounding like something it shouldn't sound like yet. Splitting. She thought about the fundamental difference between someone who managed her uncertainty and someone who was willing to be uncertain in front of her. Her phone rang again. Tristan, she declined the call. She started the car. She drove back to her studio. She did not know yet what was coming, the escalation that was already in motion, the forces already assembling at the edges of her rebuilt life. She did not know that Tristan's desperation had reached a threshold where it would stop being merely irritating and start being dangerous. She did not know that Ronan's world had edges that would eventually require her to decide what she was willing to know about the man she was falling toward. She only knew that she was very tired of being afraid of her own clarity. She parked the car. She went upstairs. She sat at her workbench and picked up the threshold piece and held it in her hand. And the door in the silver was still ambiguous, still impossible to tell, from the angle, whether the figure was going in or coming out, and she thought that she had not yet decided which direction she was moving, but she was at least finally moving. The collection was 8 pieces from completion when Tristan stopped calling. Belle noticed the silence on a Wednesday morning the way you notice when a noise you have been unconsciously bracing it against simply stops. She was at her workbench, with the 7th piece, a cuff bracelet meant to suggest a river that had changed its own course, and she realized she had not heard from him in 11 days. No calls, no voicemails, no roses appearing on her workbench from a delivery service she had never authorized to access her building. She should have felt relief. She felt instead the specific unease of someone who has been watching some slow mo and then lost sight of it around a corner. She kept working. The cuff came together over 3 days of close, exacting work, the kind of work that required her to be completely inside it, which was also the kind of work that had saved her life in small increments over the past several months. When she was deep in a piece, her brain did not have the bandwidth to run its other programs. No Tristan, no Ronan, no the complicated mathematics of her own feelings about either man. Just silver and heat, and the particular problem of making a material that was rigid behave as if it remembered moving. Sandra called on Thursday to confirm the gala venue had been finalized. A historic building in Back Bay, high ceilings, good light. The collection would be displayed in sequence, each piece with a card describing the woman whose story had inspired it, not named, at Belle's insistence, but present enough that the pieces were not just objects. The press access agreement is holding, Sandra said. 2 design publications, 1 general interest magazine. Mr. Black, Samthern confirmed your approval rights this morning. Good, the event is in 6 weeks. The pieces will be ready. There's one more thing. A brief pause. Mr. Blackthorne has asked whether you would be available to speak briefly at the gala. 5 minutes. About the design process. Belle set down her pliers. He asked this through you? He said he didn't want to pressure you directly. Belle looked at the ceiling for a moment. Tell him yes, she said. She hung up and sat with her hands flat on the workbench and thought about a man who ran an organization built on the expectation of compliance and choosing to route a simple request through an intermediary. Because he didn't want her to feel pressured to say yes. It was a small thing. It kept being a small thing she couldn't stop thinking about. Everett took her to a gallery opening the following Friday. It was a good evening, the kind that felt low pressure because it actually was. Everett was easy company. He had an architect's eye for how spaces were built and a genuine appreciation for craft, and he spent 20 minutes at a bronze sculpture discussing the pour technique with the kind of specific enthusiasm that Belle found genuinely engaging. On the sidewalk afterward, waiting for a cab, he turned to her. I like you, he said. I want to be transparent about that. Belle looked at him. I know, she said, and I think you're not available in the way I'd need you to be. She opened her mouth. Not Tristan, Everett said. I can see that's over, I just mean. He looked at the street. There's something else occupying the space. I don't know what it is, but it's there. Belle closed her mouth. The cab came. She got in and thought about Everett's perception all the way home, because he was right, and she had not been willing to say it out loud. And the fact that someone who had known her 3 years hadn't identified it in a matter of weeks was information she did not know what to do with. She let herself into her studio. She sat at the workbench. She did not sketch. She thought about Ronan Blackthorne with the particular reluctant thoroughness of someone who has been avoiding a subject and has finally run out of avoidance material. She thought about what she actually knew versus what she suspected. The legitimate business was real. She had done her research carefully, cross-referencing public records and industry reporting. Blackthorne Maritime was a substantial operation with a documented history, real clients, real infrastructure. The foundation was real. The commission was real. The money she had earned through it was sitting in her business's account, and it had come from work she had done, not from someone deciding to take care of her. And then there was the other thing. The man in the corridor with the compressed, watchful quality. The way the building felt. The particular authority Ronan carried that went beyond what legitimate business success typically generated, the authority of someone who was obeyed in rooms that had nothing to do with maritime logistics. She had looked his name up in contexts outside the business press. She had found things that were not accusations, not convictions, not anything that would hold up in a courtroom. Implications, associations, the names of organizations that appeared in the same sentences as his own, without the sentences ever completing the connection directly. She had known, she thought, from the corridor, from the compressed, watchful man. She had simply been deciding what to do with the knowing. The question was not whether Ronan Blackthorne was exactly what she suspected he was, alongside everything he demonstrably was. The question was what she did with that information, in relation to the rest of it, the contract terms, the coffee, the 3 quiet laughs, the foundation director overruled in her favor. The simple statement that he didn't know how to say what he meant without it, sounding like something it shouldn't sound like yet. She sat at the workbench until 1 in the morning without resolving anything. Then she went to bed and slept badly and woke up with her jaw aching from clenching it. The following Tuesday, Tristan walked into her studio without buzzing. She had left the downstairs door propped open while she waited for a materials delivery, a sound like green woodson, and he came up the stairs with the specific energy of a man who had been rehearsing something and had passed the point of being willing to wait for the right moment. Belle heard him on the stairs before she saw him. She recognized his footsteps. 6 years of living with someone's patterns did not disappear cleanly, and she had approximately 4 seconds to set down the piece she was working on and turn around before he appeared in the doorway. He looked bad. Not cosmetically bad, his coat was fine, his hair was managed. But his face had the quality of something under sustained pressure, the skin slightly too tight around his eyes. And he had lost weight in the particular way men lost weight when they were not sleeping. "You need to leave," Belle said, immediately. "I need 5 minutes." "I don't have 5 minutes, Belle." He came into the studio uninvited. "Please, I'm not here about us. I'm not here to ask you back. You need to stop walking into my workspace without permission." She stood up. "Turn around. The project is collapsing." He stopped in the middle of the room. He was not performing now. The strategic vulnerability she had learned to identify was gone, replaced by something rawer and less controlled. Not slowly, fast. The lenders are pulling out. The approval license that Blackthorne's subsidiary holds is the last piece that could stabilize the financing structure. And if that doesn't move in the next 3 weeks, the whole thing is finished. That has nothing to do with me. You're working with him every week. His voice was rising. You're in that building constantly. You have access to him that I've been trying to get for 8 months. I have a professional commission, Tristan. That's not access. That's work. Just tell him the project has merit. That's all I'm asking. He respects you. What I could do, Belle said, is call the police and report that you entered my business premises without permission, which is what is going to happen if you don't turn around right now. He stopped. He looked at her, and then something happened in his face that she had never seen before. Since 6 years, the complete collapse of the structure. The performance and the positioning and the careful management of impression all dropped simultaneously, and what was underneath was just a frightened man who had built something on faulty foundations and was watching it come down. "I'm going to lose everything," he said. "The project is 3 years of my life and $2 million of my own money, and if it fails, I lose the company." Belle looked at him. She felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not sympathy exactly. Not cruelty either. The flat, tired recognition that Tristan had spent 6 years treating her like a resource and had now arrived at her door, asking to be treated like a person. And the fact that she could see both of those things simultaneously was not her problem to solve for him. "I'm sorry your project is in trouble," she said. "I mean that. I know how much work it represents. But I'm not going to intervene in a professional relationship on your behalf, and I'm not able to do what you're asking. The answer is no, Belle Tristan. No, his jaw tightened. Something shifted in him, not back to the performance, but sideways into something harder. You're doing this on purpose, he said. She blinked. I'm what? Using Blackthorn, the foundation thing. You positioned yourself specifically to get close to him because you knew the subsidiary approval was connect to my project. His voice had taken on the tone she recognized from their worst arguments, the tone that meant he had found the story that made her the villain and he was going to commit to it. This is revenge. You're pretending it's professional, but this is about what happened at the dinner. Belle stood very still. She was aware of her own breathing. Get out of my studio, she said. Her voice was completely level. Admit it. I don't have to admit anything to you. Get out. Because you can't deny it. Because it's my studio and you walked in without permission and I'd like you to leave. The downstairs door opened. They both heard it, the particular sound of someone with a key, which meant it was not the materials delivery, which was expected to knock. Belle heard footsteps on the stairs that were not Tristan's footsteps and not her delivery driver's. And when Ronan appeared in the studio doorway, still in his overcoat with a rolled document in one hand, the moment arranged itself into something that had no good resolution. He took in the room in under 2 seconds. Belle, Tristan. The specific quality of the air between them. His expression did not change. That was the thing about Ronan. His face made decisions slowly and deliberately, and what it showed when he looked at Tristan Fairmont was simply nothing. Not anger, not warning. The blank professional, nothing of a man who had assessed a situation and was waiting to see if it required anything from him. Tristan's face went through several things rapidly. Recognition, then something that was partly fear and partly the instinct, which Belle watched him fight, to calculate whether this changed anything. Blackthorn, he said. Ronan looked at him for one moment. Then he looked at Belle. I have the revised gala timeline, he said, as if Tristan were furniture. Sandra said you needed the final sequence confirmed before Thursday. Belle looked at him. She understood what he was doing. The neutrality was deliberate. A choice to put the situation entirely in her hands, and she felt a complicated rush of something she did not immediately name. Yes, she said, set it on the bench. Ronan moved past Tristan without acknowledging him further and set the rolled document on the workbench. Then he stepped back and stood with his hands in his coat pockets and waited, and his waiting had the quality of a very large and very contained thing that was not going anywhere. Tristan looked at him. Something died in Tristan's posture. Mr. Blackthorn. His voice had changed, the anger was gone. The man who had been accusing Belle of revenge was gone. In his place was someone running rapid calculations. Actually, while you're here, the Fairmont Waterfront project. I understand the risk committee has been reviewing the approval license, and I'd like the opportunity to make the case directly for why. No, Ronan said, one word, no explanation, no softening. No political courtesy. Tristan blinked. If you could just The committee's findings are final. Ronan said it, the way people said things they have said before and do not intend to say again. The project doesn't meet Blackthorn's risk standards. That assessment was made before any personal considerations were relevant. It stands. Tristan looked at Belle. She met his eyes. She saw the moment he decided to believe his own story, that she had engineered this, that the coincidences were connected, that the Foundation Commission and the approval license and Ronan's presence in her studio were all part of a plan she had constructed to dismantle him. She saw him decide to believe it because the alternative that his project had failed on its own merits, that he had built on faulty foundations and made disclosures that did not survive scrutiny, that the consequences were his own, was something he could not hold. He needed her to be the architect of his failure. It was the same need that had made her the architect of his emotional life for 6 years. You'll regret this, he said. He said it to both of them, or possibly to the room, and then he turned and went down the stairs. A sound heard the downstairs door close with the particular deliberate care of someone who has decided that slamming it would give too much away. The silence afterward was the loudest silence Belle had experienced in months. She stood at her workbench. Ronan stood near the door. He came in through the prop door, Belle said. I was waiting for a delivery, I know. You don't need to. I'm not going to do anything, Ronan said. If that's what you're worried about. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with that particular expression, the one that was paying attention, filing things, processing at a speed his face didn't advertise. Did you destroy his project, she said. Because of me. No, Ronan. The financial review flagged the project 8 weeks before I knew you existed in any personal sense. He crossed to the workbench and opened the rolled document and found a page near the back and set it in front of her. This is the committee report. Look at the date. She looked at the date. October 3rd. She had met Ronan Blackthorne in late October. She looked at the report. The language was technical but not inaccessible. She had trained herself to read financial documents in the years when she'd had to be her own business manager, and what she saw in this report was a project whose numbers had been managed rather than reported. Projected occupancy rates that assumed market conditions that did not exist. Infrastructure cost, estimates that a first-year analyst would have questioned. Debt structures that worked, only if everything went right and nothing went wrong, which was not how anything worked. He built on a fantasy, she said. He built on what he needed the numbers to be. Belle folded the report closed. She thought about Tristan, counting on things that weren't there. Building structures on what he needed them to be rather than what they were. Assuming the foundations were solid because acknowledging otherwise was unbearable. She thought about 6 years of her own life. He's going to blame me for this no matter what I say, she said. Yes. And there's no version of the truth that changes that for him. Belle sat down on her work stool. She was aware of the tiredness that had been accumulating for weeks and was now sitting directly on top of her, the tiredness of rebuilding and working and navigating and doing all of it simultaneously while also managing the residue of 6 years. Of a relationship that had required her to distrust herself. The first day you came here, she said, with the velvet box. You could have sent someone, an assistant, a lawyer. Someone whose job was to handle the gesture professionally and efficiently. Ronan was quiet. You came yourself, Belle said. Yes. Why? Then he looked at her, and she had become familiar enough with his silences to know that this was the kind where he was deciding whether the honest answer was appropriate, not the kind where he didn't have one. Because she talked about you, he said. My mother. Specifically, she described you as someone who handled things like they mattered when she couldn't afford them. And he stopped. I wanted to know if the person she described was real. Belle sat with that, and more complicated than she described, he said. Which is not a complaint. Something between them shifted with the specific finality of a thing that has been in the process of shifting for a long time and has finally completed the move. Belle looked at the man. Standing in her studio, the man who ran what she now privately acknowledged was a criminal empire, alongside a legitimate one who had agreed to every contract term she threw at him, who had laughed 3 times in as many months in a way that was clearly accidental, who had routed a simple invitation through an intermediary because he hadn't wanted her to feel pressured, who had walked into a room containing her ex-fiancé and done absolutely nothing except hand her the situation and step back. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer it honestly, even if you think the honest answer is the wrong strategy. He waited. The other side of your business, she said. The part that doesn't appear in the Blackthorne Maritime quarterly reports. I'm not asking for details. I'm asking, she stopped, organized the question. I'm asking what it means for someone who is close to you. What the actual risk is, not what you'd tell a lawyer. What you'd tell someone who needed to make an informed decision. The silence was the longest silence she had ever held with him. Ronan moved to the other stool, the one across the workbench, the client's stool, and sat down. He looked at his hands for a moment. There is risk, he said. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. People in my position operate with federal attention that is persistent. The legitimate side of the business is real, and it's substantial, but it doesn't exist in isolation, and anyone associated with me closely enough is associated with all of it. He looked up at her. That is the honest answer. Thank you, Belle said. It's not a comfortable answer. No. She looked at her workbench. But I'd rather have it than the version designed to not scare me. I know, he said. That's why I gave you the other one. She looked at him. He looked back. They sat across the workbench from each other in the South End studio, where Belle Winslow made things out of metal and memory, and the honest, uncomfortable truth sat between them like a third person, and neither of them looked away from it. The gala was 17 days away when Belle got the call from Sandra. It was 9 in the morning. Belle was in the middle of the final piece, the 12th design, the one she had been saving, the one she had not fully figured out until 3 nights ago when she had woken at 4 a. With the image complete in her head, and had gone directly to the workbench in her pajamas and started working before she lost it. There's a problem, Sandra said. Belle set down the piece. Sandra's voice had the quality of someone reporting something they had spent 2 hours trying to find a way to not report and have run out of alternatives. One of the journalists, Sandra said, the one from the design magazine. She's been doing background research on the collection. That's expected. She's been researching you, and the foundation, and Ronan's connection to you. Belle's hand tightened on the phone. What does that mean? She's filed an inquiry with our communications office, asking whether the Foundation Commission was awarded to you following a personal relationship with Ronan rather than through a competitive process, and whether the collection represents a potential conflict of interest, given that. Sandra stopped. Given that your former fiancé's development project was rejected by a Blackthorn subsidiary during the same period. The studio went very quiet. Belle stared at the workbench. Tristan, she said. Not a question. We don't know who. Sandra. Her voice came out flat and cold and certain. We both know who. The silence on the other end confirmed it. Belle put the phone against her shoulder for a moment. She breathed. She thought about the look on Tristan's face when he'd said, "You'll regret this." She thought about a man who needed someone else to be the architect of his failure and had finally found a mechanism for making that story public. If the journalist ran the story, if she framed it, as she had clearly been handed the framing, as a personal relationship leveraged for a commission, as potential corruption adjacent to a criminal investigation into Blackthorn, the collection would be overshadowed before it launched. The women whose stories lived in those 12 pieces would be reduced to footnotes in a scandal narrative. The press access Belle had fought for would become press access aimed at a different story entirely. And Belle's career, which she had spent 2 years rebuilding from the ground up on her own terms, would be reframed as something she had obtained through proximity to a powerful and legally questionable man. She put the phone back to her ear. Don't respond to the journalist yet, she said. I need to make a call. She hung up. She sat very still for 30 seconds. Then she called Ronan. He answered on the second ring. I know, he said before she had spoken. How long have you known? Sandra called me first. 20 minutes ago. And you were going to tell me when. I was giving you 20 minutes before I called. His voice was even. I didn't want to call you in the middle of the first few minutes of it. Belle shut her eyes. There it was again, the consideration that arrived in the form of space rather than management. The deliberate choice to let her have the initial reaction without him in it. She opened her eyes. This came from Tristan, she said. Almost certainly. He can't prove a personal relationship because there isn't one in the form he's implying. But he doesn't need to prove it. He just needs the question to be asked publicly. Yes, which means the story isn't the truth. The story is the question itself. Yes. Belle looked at the 12 pieces arranged on her workbench. The threshold pendant, the shoreline cuff, the river bracelet. 11 pieces of work that had come from real grief and real women, and 3 months of the most committed work she had done in her career, and they were now potentially going to be buried under a narrative she had not written and could not fully refute. What are options? She said. His voice was still even. We get ahead of it, or we respond to it. Getting ahead means issuing a proactive statement through the foundation that establishes the timeline of the commission, the competitive legitimacy of the process, and the separation between my business decisions and the foundation. What's the competitive legitimacy? She said. There was no competitive process. You came directly to me. I came to you based on documented professional criteria, he said. My mother's account, your maker's mark, your work, history, and reputation in the field. Sandra can reconstruct the decision rationale in professional terms. That's technically accurate. It is accurate, but it will look constructed. Yes. A pause, it will look constructed, because we're constructing it after the fact. That's the problem with getting ahead of a story. You are, to some degree, building the scaffold in public. Belle's jaw was tight, and the second option. Let the journalist run her story, Ronan said. Don't engage. Let the collection speak. The timeline is documentable independently, the foundation records, the contract dates, the committee report on Tristan's project. Anyone who wants to verify it can. In the meantime, the story exists. Yes, and the collection gets buried in the noise. Possibly. Possibly not. Depends on which story is more interesting. He paused. A jewelry designer whose work speaks for itself, or a scandal that turns out not to be a scandal when the documents are examined. Belle picked up the threshold pendant. She turned it in her fingers. The door in the silver was still ambiguous. She had still not decided, when she designed it, whether the figure was entering or leaving, and the ambiguity had seemed like the point, the moment of suspension, before the direction becomes irreversible. She was in that moment now. If I do the gala speech, she said, and I make it about the women, about the specific work and the specific stories, and you stay off the platform entirely. Yes, and we release the full document timeline proactively. Contract date, committee report date, every meeting. I'll have legal prepare it today, Ronan. Yes. If this damages the collection, if those women's stories get swallowed by this, then we find another venue and we tell the stories anyway. His voice was completely certain. The collection doesn't end if the gala becomes complicated. The pieces exist. The work exists. I'll fund a secondary event if we need to. I know it's not the same, but it's what I have to offer. Belle set the pendant down. She thought about Tristan, who had spent 6 years managing her fears and now, at the end of it, had aimed directly at the thing she had rebuilt most carefully: her work, her independence, her ability to stand in a room on her own merits. She thought about the fact that his final weapon was not her relationship with Ronan, which was ambiguous and developing and private. His final weapon was the suggestion that Belle Winslow was incapable of earning anything without a man behind her. And she thought, you spent 6 years teaching me to believe that, and I believed it. And I spent the last several months proving otherwise piece by piece, and you are not going to take that back. Schedule a call with your legal team for this afternoon, she said. I want to see the document timeline before anyone sends it anywhere. I need to be satisfied it's accurate before my name goes on anything. I'll send you the draft first. And Ronan, yes. When this is over, she stopped, restarted. When the gala is over and the collection is done, and I'm not in the middle of a situation where every decision I make can be read as professionally compromised. Yes, he said, quietly, not pushing, not completing the sentence for her. We need to finish the conversation we started in the conference room. Pause. I'll be here, he said. Belle hung up. She sat in her studio, surrounded by 12 pieces of work that had cost her 3 months of everything she had, and she felt the specific clarity that came from understanding, without question, what she was not willing to lose. She was not willing to lose this, not the pieces, not the women's stories, not the work she had done without anyone's money or rescue or intervention. She picked up the 12th piece, the final design, the one she had made at 4 a.m. from the image she woke up with, and she examined it under the light. It was a ring which she had not planned to make. A ring was not on the original commission list. But she had woken with the image and made it anyway, because the story it came from the final woman's profile, the one whose experience most closely mapped to something she had not quite been able to name until recently required it. The ring was wide and slightly irregular in the band, worked from mixed metals, silver, and a thin vein of gold running through it like a fault line. It was not a perfect ring. The imperfection was load-bearing. It was, she realized now, looking at it under the studio light with Tristan's war already begun, and Ronan's voice still in her ear, a piece about what it felt like to choose yourself. She set it down. She picked up her tools. She had 17 days, and a fight she had not started, but was absolutely going to finish. The legal document ran 14 pages. Belle read every word. She sat at her workbench, with the draft on her screen and a cup of coffee that went cold before she reached page 6, and she read it the way she read everything. Now slowly, looking for the places where precision became ambiguity, where accuracy shaded into convenience. It was accurate. That was what she kept coming back to, the thing that refused to become complicated, no matter how many times she tested it. The commission had been awarded on October 22nd. The Risk Committee report on Tristan's project was dated October 3rd. The Foundation's planning records showed Sandra had begun scoping a designer commission in September. Belle's maker's mark, the crescent, and the flame appeared in photographs from the Fairmont dinner taken by a catering company whose time-stamped records placed them at 7:43 in the evening, more than 2 hours before Tristan's confession, more than 2 hours before Belle had walked out. The timeline did not lie. Tristan had handed a story whose foundation crumbled the moment anyone looked at a date. The problem was that most people did not look at dates. Most people read the question and held it. She called Ronan's legal team at 2 in the afternoon and walked through 4 specific language changes, not because the substance were written in a way that positioned the Foundation's decision-making as reactive rather than independent. And she was not going to submit a document that even accidentally suggested the commission had been awarded in response to anything personal. The lead attorney, a woman named Claire, with the clipped efficiency of someone who billed by the 6-minute increment, took the notes without pushback. Mr. Blackthorne said to give you full editorial authority on anything involving your professional representation, Claire said. I know, Belle said. I'm using it. She hung up and sent the revised language by email, and then sat very still for a moment, with her hands in her lap. Full editorial authority. He had done that without being asked. She picked up the threshold pendant from the display rack where she had moved all 12 pieces for safekeeping, and she held it until her hands stopped being cold. The document went out the following morning under the Foundation's letterhead, addressed to the journalist's editor and copied to 3 design publications, 2 cultural reporters who covered Boston's philanthropic sector, and the Foundation's own press list. Sandra had wanted to soften the timeline section. Belle had declined. The dates are the argument. Belle told her in a 7-minute phone call that she had no patience to extend. If we soften the dates, we soften the only thing that matters. The dates stay as written. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Ronan said the same thing, she said. Then we agree, Belle said. Good. Send it. The document went out at 9:17 a.m. By noon, the journalist had responded to Sandra's office with a request for comment from Belle directly. Belle had been expecting this. She typed the response herself, without consulting anyone, because it was her name and her work, and she was not going to have either of those things filtered through someone else's professional caution. The commission was awarded based on documented professional criteria established by the Margaret Blackthorne Foundation prior to any personal acquaintance between myself and Mr. Blackthorne. The timeline is verifiable through Foundation records, which have been provided in full. The collection represents 12 pieces of original work, designed in response to 12 real women's experiences of loss and reconstruction. Any characterization of it as anything other than that is factually incorrect, and I am happy to discuss the work itself with any journalist who would like to understand it. She read it twice, she sent it. Then she went back to the workbench and picked up her tools and finished the final setting on the 12th piece, the imperfect ring, the one about choosing yourself, and when she set it in the display rack beside the other 11, she felt the specific satisfaction of something completed that had been worth the cost of completing it. 4 days before the gala, Tristan called her from an unknown number. She almost didn't answer unknown numbers. She had started screening them after the 3rd week of declined calls, when he'd started getting creative with the area codes. But something made her press, accept some instinct she had started, cautiously, to trust again. I know it was you, she said, without greeting. A pause. I don't know what you, Tristan. Her voice was the voice she now used for situations that did not require heat. Flat. Certain. the voice of someone who had already passed through the part of the conversation where anger was useful. I know you gave the journalist the framing. I know you implied the commission was personal. The timeline has been released, and it shows you're wrong. But you know that already, because the story hasn't run. She can't run it without a fact-based silence, she said. That's actually my question, not the logistics of it. Why? He breathed. Because you walked out, he said finally. Of that dinner, and everything just kept moving for you. The commission, the collection. You were fine. You were better than fine. And I was watching my project die. Belle looked at her workbench. You wanted me to not be fine, she said. He stopped. I don't know what I wanted. Something to stop moving so fast in a direction that didn't include me. She thought about that for a moment. She thought about a man who had spent years needing to be the most important variable in any equation involving Belle Winslow, and had discovered, after removing himself from the equation, that the equation had continued without him. It won't work, she said. Not cruelly, just as information. Not because of Ronan, because the work is documented. Pieces exist. The women, therefore, are real. You can't make that into what you're trying to make it into. Belle, I don't want anything from you, she said. Not an apology, not an explanation. I just want you to stop. She hung up. She sat for a moment. Then she stood up and went into the small kitchen, adjacent to the studio, and made fresh coffee, and she stood at the counter while it brewed, and thought about the fact that the call had made her tired rather than angry, which felt like important information about where she currently was. The gala fell on a Thursday in late November. The Back Bay building had been built in 1887 for purposes that had nothing to do with art or jewelry, and its bones showed it high coffered ceilings, deep-set windows, floors that were original and imperfect in the way that 140 years of being walked on produced. The Foundation's events team had installed track lighting along the display sequence, low and directed, so that each piece was lit without flooding the surrounding space. Belle arrived 2 hours early and walked the display alone. The sequence moved from left to right through the main hall, 12 pieces in 12 pools of light, each with a card that described in 3 sentences the experience that had informed the design. The threshold pendant came first. The shoreline cuff came fourth. The river bracelet came seventh. The imperfect ring, which had not been on the original commission keyset, and which Sandra had initially questioned, and which Belle had insisted on including, came last. She stood in front of each piece for approximately 30 seconds. She was looking for the thing that told her whether she had gotten it right. Not aesthetically, she knew the aesthetics were right. She was looking for whether the piece was honest, whether it contained the thing it was supposed to contain rather than the thing that was easier to make. One by one she found it. The threshold pendant still refused to resolve its ambiguity. You still couldn't tell, from the angle of the figure in the silver, whether it was going in or coming out. A sound like green wood splitting, a woman standing in front of it for the first time, would make a choice about which direction it was moving, and that choice would tell her something about herself. That was correct. That was what it was supposed to do. Belle straightened the small card in front of the final piece, the ring, and stepped back. The light hit the fault line of gold running through the silver band and made it look, from 6 feet away, like something that had broken and been repaired and was stronger for it. She hadn't planned that effect. The piece had done it on its own. She went to find her coat and the notes for her speech, and she did not cry, which she was privately glad about, because she was wearing the kind of eye makeup that did not survive crying with dignity. The room filled from 7. Belle stood near the entrance to the display hall and watched people come in. She knew some of them, Sandra's network, Foundation board members, 2 clients of hers who had received invitations. She did not know most of them. Boston's philanthropic and cultural sectors were large enough that a significant gathering could be composed entirely of strangers who nonetheless all seemed to know each other. Ronan arrived at 7:20. He did not arrive in a group. He did not have an assistant at his elbow or a security presence that announced itself. He came in the way he went everywhere simply, already occupying the room by the time you registered he was in it. He wore a dark suit that was not trying too hard, which was the only kind he ever seemed to wear. A sound like green wood splitting, and he stopped just inside the entrance and looked at the display hall and then found her in the crowd the way she was beginning to understand. He found things without apparent effort, without the scanning quality that other people had when they were looking for someone. He crossed to her. "How are you?" he said. "I'm okay." She meant it. "Pieces are right, I know. I walked through at 6. She looked at him. "You came early. I wanted to see them without the crowd." And something moved in his expression. The ring wasn't on the original list. "No, it's the best piece." Belle looked at the display hall. "I know," she said. The speeches were brief by design. The Foundation's board chair spoke for 4 minutes about the origins of the Margaret Blackthorne Foundation and its mission. Sandra spoke for 2 minutes about the commission process. Then Belle took the small podium. She had 3 pages of notes. She did not use them. She looked at the room, the 70-odd people holding drinks and looking at her with the polite attention of an audience that expected to be mildly moved and then go back to the cocktail hour, and she decided, in the 3 seconds before she opened her mouth, that politely moved was not sufficient. "I designed these pieces for women who rebuilt something after it was destroyed," she said. "Not women who recovered. Recovering implies you go back to what you were. These women went somewhere else, somewhere the loss made possible." She paused. "I started this commission in the middle of the worst several months of my professional and personal life. I don't say that for sympathy, I say it because it's the context in which these pieces got made, and context matters when you're trying to understand what something contains." She looked at the display sequence on her left. Every piece in this room was built from a question. Not how do I make this beautiful? How do I make this honest? Those are different problems. Honest is harder. The room was quieter than it had been. The last piece, the ring, at the end of the sequence, wasn't in the original commission. I made it at 4 in the morning because I woke up with the image and couldn't lose it. It's for a woman who described the experience of rebuilding herself after years of being told that her instincts were wrong. She said the strangest part was learning to trust what she already knew. Belle looked at the room. "I understood that. I made the piece for her, but I also made it for the part of myself that needed to understand it." She stepped back from the podium. "These pieces are not mine," she said. "They belong to the women who lived the stories. I just made the containers. Please look at them carefully." She stepped away. The applause was not the polite kind. The crowd moved into the display sequence, and Belle moved through the periphery, answering questions from the journalists who found her, watching people stand in front of the pieces with the specific stillness that meant something had connected. The journalist who had received Tristan's tip was there. Belle had known she would be. She was on the confirmed press list, and uninviting her would have looked exactly like what it wasn't. She was a woman in her 40s, with the particular watchful quality of someone whose job required her to stay skeptical of everything she found moving, and she stood in front of the threshold pendant for a long time. Then she came to find Belle. "The timeline document," she said, without preamble. "Yes," Belle said. "It's clean, it is. The source who brought me the story framed it very specifically." She looked at Belle. "I should have verified before I made the inquiry. I apologize for that." Belle looked at her. She had not expected an apology. She had prepared for several alternative versions of this conversation, and this was not one of them. "The story you were given was designed to make my work look like a transaction," Belle said. "It wasn't. The timeline shows that. But more than the timeline," she gestured toward the display hall. "Look at the work. That's the answer." The journalist looked at her for a moment. "Can I quote your speech?" "Yes." Directly, no paraphrasing. "The ring piece at the end." She paused. "The card says it was made for a woman who learned to trust what she already knew. Was that you?" Belle met her eyes. "Partially," she said. "That's how it works. The best pieces are always partially you." Ronan found her near the end of the evening, when the crowd had thinned to the people who were there because to stay rather than because they needed to be seen. They stood together in front of the threshold pendant. It's sold," Belle said. "Someone made an offer during the cocktail hour." Sandra nearly fainted. "All 12? 10 confirmed. 2 pending." She looked at the pendant. The foundation gets 40%. The rest is mine. You didn't negotiate that down. Sandra tried. I told her 40% was fair, given what the foundation did for the collection's visibility. She paused. It's the right number. Ronan was quiet. You could have taken more, he said. Not as a criticism, as an observation. I didn't need more. She looked at the pendant. I needed the right number. He looked at it beside her. The tiny silver door, the ambiguous figure, the light catching the work in the way it had been catching it all evening. Which direction is it going? He said. I don't know, Belle said. I made it that way deliberately. Which direction do you see? He looked at it for a long moment. In, he said. It's going in. Why? Because the posture, the weight distribution. It's not the posture of someone leaving. It's the posture of someone deciding to stay. Belle turned her head and looked at him. He was still looking at the pendant. Ronan, she said. He turned. They were closer than they usually stood, the crowd having compressed the evening toward its conclusion. A sound like green wood splitting and the particular quality of the space between them was not the professional space that had characterized their meetings, or the careful distance of two people being deliberate about what was developing. It was just close. I asked you to figure out how to say it, she said. His jaw moved. I know. It's been 6 weeks. I know. Have you figured it out? He looked at her with the directness that had become familiar and still had the capacity to rearrange the air. Every morning for the past 2 months, he said, the first thing I think about is whether I have a reason to come to your studio that day. His voice was low and completely even. The way it was when he was saying something that had been held down for a long time. Most of the time I manufacture one. The clasps. The document timeline. The gala sequence. I find something that justifies the visit, and I come, and the justification is always real, but it's not the reason. Belle looked at him. I've been the most feared man in a lot of rooms, he said. That has never once made me feel as. He stopped. Restarted, because Ronan Blackthorne did not leave sentences unfinished when they mattered. As uncertain as standing in your studio, not knowing if what I wanted was something you'd choose. The room was quiet around them. You're telling me this now, she said. In the middle of a gala. You said when the gala was over. A brief thing crossed his expression, the almost smile, the internal adjustment. It's almost over. Belle looked at the threshold pendant one more time. Going in, he had said. The posture of someone deciding to stay. She turned back to him. I ended things with Everett, she said. 3 weeks ago, he already knew. He said there was something occupying the space. She paused. He was right. Ronan's expression did not perform relief. It absorbed it. She could see the shift. The thing held for a long time recalibrating. Bells, he said. I need you to hear something first, she said. Before anything else, he waited. My studio is mine, she said. My career is mine. The success that's coming from this collection, whatever comes next from it, is mine. I didn't build it for you, and I didn't build it because of you, and I'm not going to let it become something that looks like either of those things. I know my decisions stay mine. All of them. Including this one. I know that too, and the other part of your life. She held his eyes. I'm not pretending I don't know what I know. I'm telling you I know it, and I'm choosing anyway. But that choice is conditional on you never using any part of it on my behalf or as a shield around me. If I'm ever in real danger, that's a different conversation. Everything else, Tristan, professional disputes. Anyone who gives me trouble in my business, I handle myself. Yes, he said, simply without negotiating. You agree to that? I agreed to it in my head the second week I came to your studio, he said. I was trying to find the right moment to say it. Belle stood in the almost empty gala hall with the 12 pieces of her best work surrounding her and Ronan Blackthorne 3 feet away telling her, without elegance or performance, that he had been waiting for her to choose. She took one step toward him. He went completely still, the way very large things went still when they were paying total attention. She reached up and touched his jaw with her fingertips. His eyes closed for a fraction of a second. Just that, just the involuntary acknowledgement of contact. And then they opened again, and he looked at her with everything he'd been carrying for 2 months visible in his face simultaneously. Move closer, she said. He moved closer but did not touch her, and she understood that this was also deliberate, that he was giving her the last of the distance to close herself. She closed it. She kissed him in the gala hall, surrounded by 12 pieces that had gone through something and come out somewhere else. And his hand came up to her face with a gentleness that was not what she had expected from a man who ran an empire on certainty, but which was, she thought, exactly what she should have expected from a man who had waited without demanding. When she pulled back, his forehead came to rest against hers. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "The ring," she said quietly. "The end of the sequence. What about it?" "It's yours," she said. "It was always going to be." He pulled back enough to look at her. "I made it about choosing yourself," she said. "That's still what it is. But the night I made it, the image I woke up with you were in it. I don't know what that means exactly. I just know it's true." Ronan looked at her in the low-directed light of the gala hall. He looked at her the way she had first noticed him looking at things, with the quality of something being filed permanently, carefully, in a place that did not have exits. "What does it mean," he said slowly, "that I've been building reasons to come back to your stew for 2 months, and the real reason was sitting on your workbench the whole time?" Belle looked at him. "It means," she said, "that you have terrible instincts about your own feelings, but excellent taste in jewelry." The laugh, the fourth one, the one that was completely unguarded and arrived like something that had been kept in a compressed space for a long time, came out of him quietly and without performance. And Belle stood in the center of it and thought that she had now heard that laugh 4 times in 2 months, and was fairly certain she was going to spend a significant portion of her future trying to produce it. They left the gala together. Not publicly, not in the way that announced itself. They left the way 2 people left when they had talked long past the end of the event without noticing. And the last of the guests were gone. A sound like green wood splitting, and Sandra was giving Belle a look that contained the entire complicated history of a woman who had watched something develop over 3 months and was now diplomatically pretending she was only interested in the event debrief. Belle told Sandra she'd call her in the morning. Outside, the November air was sharp and immediate, and Belle pulled her coat around herself and stood on the sidewalk, while Ronan signaled for his car, and she thought about the threshold pendant going in, he had said, and about the imperfect ring that had found its owner without her planning it. His car pulled up. He held the door. She stopped before getting in. A sound like green wood splitting. She turned to face him in the cold outside the building, where 12 pieces of her best work were being carefully wrapped and catalogued and made ready to travel into the lives of the people who had bought them. "I want you to know something," she said. He waited. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. "Not of what you are. Not of any of it." She looked at him steadily. "I just needed you to know that I'm choosing this with full information." Ronan looked at her for a long moment in the cold Boston air. "That," he said quietly, "is the most terrifying and the most important thing anyone has ever said to me." Belle got in the car. He came in after her, and the door closed, and the city moved past the windows. And she sat beside the most feared man in Boston, thinking that the night had arrived at exactly the place she had not known. She was moving toward, and had apparently been moving toward all along. And outside the Back Bay building behind them, the last of the lights went off in the gala hall, and the 12 pieces waited in their careful wrapping, containing what they contained, ready to go where they were going. And somewhere in the darkened hall, the threshold pendant sat in its tissue paper, with the ambiguous figure caught at the door, and in the morning, whoever unwrapped it would decide for themselves which way it was facing, and they would be right. Because the whole point of the piece was that the direction depended entirely on who was looking and what they needed it to mean. Belle leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. She was not afraid. She was completely awake, and she was, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, exactly where she had chosen to be. The morning after the gala, Belle woke up in her own bed. She noted this with a specific kind of satisfaction, not the defensive satisfaction of someone proving a point, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who had made a deliberate choice and felt good about having made it. She had come home alone. Ronan's car had dropped her at her building at 11:40, and he had not asked to come up, and she had not invited him. and the not asking and the not inviting had been its own kind of communication, the particular language of two people who understood that the thing between them was real enough to not require rushing. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling. The collection had sold 10 pieces in one evening. Hermtine too had offers pezzing that Sandra had texted about at 7:30 in the morning, which meant Sandra had either not slept or had been awake since 5, both of which seemed plausible. Belle looked at the text and put the phone face down on the mattress and lay there for another few minutes, just being still. She was thinking about the threshold pendant. She was thinking about who had bought it. She had not asked during the evening because the sales were handled through the foundation, and she had deliberately kept herself out of the transaction side of things. But she wanted to know. She had a specific hope about it that she recognized as irrational and held on to anyway, because some things were allowed to be irrational. She got up and made coffee and stood at her kitchen window and watched the South End go through its early morning operations, the dog walkers, the delivery trucks. The woman who ran every day at 6:15 and had been running past Belle's building for the 2 years Belle had lived here, without ever appearing to look at anything except the middle distance. Belle envied her the simplicity of that. Then she went to her workbench. The call from Sandra came at 9. Both pending offers confirmed, Sandra said. Full collection sold. Total revenue, she named a number. Belle sat down. She had calculated the approximate figure. She had been realistic about it. She had not been quite realistic enough. The foundation's 40%, Belle said automatically. Already separated. Your portion is being processed to the account you specified. Sandra paused. Belle, this is even accounting for the press complications. This is a significant outcome. Yes. The design publication, the one whose journalist had the... Sandra stopped. Started again. They've requested a profile, not of the collection. Of you, the work. Who you are as a designer. Belle looked at her workbench. At the tools laid out in the order, she always laid them out, which was not the order anyone had taught her, but the order she had developed over years of her own practice. The order that made sense to her hands. Tell them I'm available for a conversation in January, she said. After the holidays. I'm not doing interviews while I'm still processing the collection. They'll want to know if January, Belle said. Sandra accepted this. One more thing, she said. The threshold pendant. The buyer asked for it to remain anonymous, but she asked me to pass along a message to the designer. Belle's hand tightened on the phone. She said. Sandra's voice changed slightly, the brisk efficiency softening into something more careful. She said she stood in front of it for 20 minutes and the figure was going in, and that she'd been looking for something to hang in the entrance of the house she just bought by herself. And this was it. Belle looked at the window. She did not say anything for a moment. Thank you, she said finally. She also donated an additional 10% above the sale price to the foundation. Belle pressed her free hand flat against the workbench. Okay, she said. I'm good, Belle said. Sandra, thank you. For all of it. The whole 3 months. A brief pause. Thank you for the work, Sandra said. Margaret would have... She stopped. She would have been impossible about it. In the best way. She had very strong opinions. So do I, Belle said. I know, Sandra said, and it sounded like a compliment. Tristan's project collapsed on a Wednesday. Belle read about it in the business section of the Boston Globe's digital edition, which she had never before, in her life, read with any regularity but had been monitoring since the gala with the particular attention of someone waiting for a shoe to drop. The headline was not dramatic. Business headlines rarely were when the drama was in the details. Fairmont Waterfront Development halts operations following lender withdrawal. Below it, 4 paragraphs describing what the Blackthorn Risk Committee report had identified in October: inflated projections, incomplete disclosures, a financing structure that required perfect conditions to survive. The lenders had reviewed the documentation, made available through the project's regulatory filing, and had withdrawn in sync with the previous 6 weeks. A quote from Tristan described the situation as a challenging market environment and a temporary operational pause. Belle read it twice. She felt nothing she had not already felt. The grief for the relationship had run its course months ago. The anger about his specific campaign against her had burned down to something more like residue than fire. What was left when she read the headline was a complicated, unsentimental understanding of a man who had built his project the same way he had built their relationship, on what he needed the numbers to be rather than what they were, and had been blindsided when reality declined to cooperate. She closed the browser tab. She did not call anyone about it. She went back to work. The neighboring storefront had been empty for 4 months when Belle first called the landlord. She had been watching it since August, a space 2 doors down, half again the size of her current studio, with a large north-facing window that was the kind of light source jewelry work required, and rarely found at a reasonable price in the South End. She had been watching it and calculating and talking herself out of it, and calculating again. The collection's revenue had clarified the arithmetic. She called the landlord on a Thursday morning. She negotiated the lease herself over 4 phone calls across 2 weeks, because she had by now become fluent enough in her own contracts to know where the weakness usually lived. She got a 2-year term with a renewal option, a tenant improvement allowance, and a clause about subletting that gave her flexibility if the business needed to restructure. She signed the lease on a December afternoon with the pen she kept on her workbench, the one with the cracked barrel she kept meaning to replace and never did. She called Corinne. "I signed the lease," she said. "Oh, thank God," Corinne said. "I was going to lose my mind if you talked yourself out of it again." "I almost did. 3 times. I know you told me twice and I inferred the third." She could hear her sister's smile. "How does it feel?" Belle looked at the signed lease on her workbench. "Like something that's mine," she said. "Just mine. That's the best kind of something." They talked for an hour, the way they had started talking again after the dinner, long, wandering conversations that covered everything and held nothing back. The conversations of sisters who had rediscovered the version of it that existed before a man had tried to position them as rivals. Corinne was finishing her graduate degree in the spring. She had a job offer in environmental litigation. She was seeing someone she described as deeply normal in a way that she intended as the highest possible compliment. "I like normal," Corinne said. "Normal is underrated." "Normal is very rated," Belle said. "That's why it's called normal." "You know what I mean." Belle did know what she meant. Vahan. They hung up, and Belle sat in her studio and thought about the difference between what Tristan had tried to make of their relationship, the zero-sum competition between 2 sisters for a man's preference, and what it actually was, which was 2 women who loved each other and had been separated temporarily by someone who had needed them to be. The temporary had ended. The love had been there the whole time, waiting. Ronan came to the studio on a Saturday. He called ahead, which he had done every time since the beginning, without exception, which was a thing Belle had noted early and continued to note because it was not a small thing. He arrived with a paper bag from a coffee place 2 blocks away that made espresso she had mentioned once, in passing, as being the best in the neighborhood, which meant he had remembered a passing comment and acted on it, which was also not a small thing. He set the coffee on the workbench. He looked at the empty space where the 12 collection pieces had lived for 3 months. "Strange," he said. "Very," she said. "I keep reaching for the threshold pendant and then remembering." "Is that difficult?" She thought about it honestly. "Not the way I expected. It's more like the feeling after you finish a book you loved. The missing it is part of it." He looked at the workbench. "What comes next?" he said. Not as pressure, as genuine question. "I don't know yet," she said. "I have some ideas. Nothing I'm ready to commit to." She looked at the tools laid out in her order. "I want to let the space be empty for a little while." "I've never done that." There's always been the next thing queued up before the current thing was finished. Ronan picked up his coffee. "Good," he said. She looked at him. "That's what you said," she said, "when I told you I'd started reading every contract. First day with the foundation proposal. I remember. You say it when you mean that someone's made the right decision for themselves." He looked at her over the coffee cup. "Yes," he said. Belle leaned against the workbench. "The storefront 2 doors down," she said. "I signed the lease on Thursday." He went still, not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of someone absorbing something significant. "You didn't tell me you were looking." I didn't tell anyone except Corinne. I needed to make the decision without anyone else's opinion in the room. She watched his face. Are you bothered by that? He looked at the window. No, he said. He stopped. I was going to say I wish I'd known, but that's not honest. I think I'm glad you did it exactly the way you did it. Even though you weren't told. Because I wasn't told. He looked at her. You built the collection without my money. You negotiated the lease without my contacts. You're expanding your business without any resource that comes from me. He said it, with a quality she did not immediately identify, and then she identified it. It was pride. Not possessive pride. The pride of someone who had watched a person do something genuinely difficult and was glad it had happened. Belle looked at him. She thought about 6 years of a man who had subtly, persistently, made her feel that her achievements were fragile without his support. She thought about what it was to stand in front of someone whose response to her independence was pride. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. After the gala, the conversation we had in front of the threshold pendant, she collected the words carefully. I meant all of it. I mean it now. And I want you to know that I'm not afraid of what I know about you. I've thought clearly, and I've made a choice, and I'm not in the habit anymore of pretending I haven't made choices I've actually made. Ronan set the coffee down. He looked at her with the full, undivided attention she had come to recognize as his most honest mode. But I need to ask you something, she said. And I need the honest answer, not the strategic one. Yes. Is there anything from your world that is going to arrive in my life without warning? A consequence I don't know to prepare for. A risk you haven't told me about because you didn't think it was relevant. He was quiet. It was the longest quiet she had ever held with him. There's a federal matter, he said. An ongoing investigation. It's been ongoing for 4 years, and it will continue. My legal team has managed it carefully. I believe it will not produce a prosecution. He looked at his hands briefly. I'm not certain of that, I believe it. Belle looked at him. What's the worst case, she said. The worst case is a prosecution that my lawyers have spent 4 years building a defense against. His voice did not shift from its even register. The probability is low. The possibility is real. And if it happens, then I face it, he said. I don't run. I've never run from anything in my life. Belle took that in. She turned it over. She thought about the women who had informed the 12 pieces, the woman who had rebuilt after loss, the woman who had learned to trust her own instincts, the woman who had bought the threshold pendant and put it in the entrance of the house she'd bought for herself. She thought about the fact that none of their stories were stories about finding a situation that was simple. All of them were stories about finding a situation they could live with and moving into it with open eyes. Thank you, she said. You're still here, he said. I said I made my choice with full information, she said. That's what full information looks like. It's not comfortable. It's real. She picked up her coffee. I'd rather have real. Something in his face moved. I know, he said quietly. That's I know. They stood in the studio together, in the early December light, with the empty space where the collection had been between them and the coffee going warm in their hands. And Belle thought that this was what it actually looked like, not the cinematic moment, not the dramatic declaration, but 2 people in a room choosing each other with the full weight of what that meant, and the full knowledge that the weight was real. January arrived with the specific cruelty of Boston January, cold that had opinions, cold that was not interested in whether you had somewhere to be. Belle opened the expanded studio on the 12th. She had not done a formal opening. She had not invited press or clients or anyone from the foundation. She had unlocked the door of the neighboring storefront at 8 in the morning, walked through the empty space, and stood at the large north-facing window for approximately 5 minutes looking at the way the light came in. Then she had gone back to her original studio and gotten her tools. She had begun the process of determining how to think about the new space, what it was for, how it would function, what work it might make possible that the current studio did not. She had brought a sketchbook and nothing else, because the sketchbook was how she thought, and she needed to think before she built. She sat on the floor of the empty storefront, with the sketchbook open in her lap and the January light falling across the paper, and she drew things that were not jewelry. She drew the space itself. She drew the window. She drew a bench configuration that would allow two people to work simultaneously without being in each other's way, not because she was planning to hire immediately, but because the possibility was one she was now holding as a real future, rather than an abstract one. She drew something that was not quite a pendant, and not quite a ring, but had qualities of both an object she couldn't name yet, which meant she wasn't ready to make it, which meant she put a star next to it and moved on. She drew for 2 hours. Then she went next door and made coffee and called one of the clients who had been waiting for a commission slot since October. She was open. The profile piece ran in February. The journalist had spent 2 afternoons with Belle in the studio, the original one, not the expanded space. Because the expanded space was still in the process of becoming, and Belle was not ready to show it to anyone who was going to write about it. She had answered the questions carefully and honestly, and had declined to answer 2 of them, both of which involved Ronan, with a directness that the journalist had accepted without apparent resentment. The piece ran under a headline that Belle had not been consulted about and would not have chosen, the designer who builds grief into gold. She found it slightly overwrought, but not inaccurate, which was about as well as she expected things to go with headlines. The body of the piece was good. It focused on the work. It described the commission, the women whose profiles had informed the pieces, the design philosophy that had emerged over the course of the collection. It quoted her speech from the gala directly, as the journalist had promised. It mentioned Ronan Blackthorne once, as the founder of the foundation that had commissioned the collection, with no additional commentary. The journalist had chosen the work. Belle read the piece twice, sitting at her workbench in the early morning, and then she put her phone down and picked up the thing she was, currently in the middle of a private commission. A woman who wanted a piece to mark her retirement after 40 years in medicine and went back to work. Her phone started ringing at 9. It did not stop ringing in any meaningful way for 3 days. She hired her first employee in March. A 26-year-old named Marcus who had a degree in metalsmithing from RISD and the particular quality of someone who had learned to make things carefully and was hungry to learn to make them better. He was precise, self-directed, heart-talt, green-rected, and had a reckonite of going very quiet when he was someone actually inside the sign of someone who was actually inside the problem rather than performing industriousness. She showed him her ordering system on his first day. She showed him where the tools lived and how they were organized, and what the rules were about the workbench, her workbench, not his, which had its own organizational logic that he was welcome to develop for himself. Question, she said? Yeah. He looked at the tool arrangement on her bench. Why that order? For the forming tools? Because that's the order my hands want them, she said. Your hands will want something different. He thought about that. Okay, he said. He was good from the first week. By the 3rd week, he had developed a tool arrangement that bore no resemblance to hers and was clearly working for him, and Belle left it alone, which was the whole point. Corinne came up from Cambridge on a Saturday in April for no specific reason other than spring had arrived, and she missed her sister, which was reason enough. They walked to the coffee place, 2 blocks from the studio, the one with the espresso Ronan had remembered from a passing comment, and sat outside in the thin April sun with their cups and their coats and the particular ease of sisters who had relearned each other. Tell me about Ronan, Corinne said. It was the first time she had asked directly. Belle looked at her coffee. What do you want to know? What it's like. Actually like. Not the version you'd tell someone who was going to worry. Belle thought about how to answer that honestly. It's like she stopped. Started again. It's like being with someone who has decided that the most important thing is that I keep deciding freely. Not because it's strategically useful for him, because he actually believes it. She looked at the street. After 6 years of someone who managed my insecurities to keep me manageable, it's an adjustment. In the best possible way. Corinne looked at her. Are you happy? She said. The word sat between them. Belle thought about it the way she thought about design questions, not reaching for the comfortable answer, looking for the honest one. I'm something better than happy, she said. I'm satisfied. With the work, with the studio, with the choice I made. She looked at Corinne. Happy is a weather condition. Satisfied is structural. Corinne looked at her for a moment. That's the most Belle sentence you have ever said to me, she said. Belle laughed. It was a real laugh, the full kind, the kind that arrived without announcement. Corinne laughed too. They sat outside in the April sun and laughed about nothing and everything. And a woman walking past with a strollers slowed slightly at the sound of it, not intrusively, just the reflexive response to two people laughing genuinely in public, which was a sound that tended to make people briefly want to be near it. The evening that became important happened in May. Not because it was planned, as an important evening it was not. It was a Thursday. Belle had worked late on the medical commission, which was nearly complete, and Marcus had left at 6, and she was doing the last of the detail work alone in the original studio, when Ronan arrived with takeout from a place she had mentioned once, 2 months ago, as being very good on cold nights, which meant he had been carrying that information since winter and had found the right moment to act on it. He set the food on the small table she used for client consultations. He did not suggest they move to a restaurant or a different location or anywhere other than where she already was. They ate at the consultation table in the South End studio while the detail work dried on the workbench, and the May evening came in through the windows she had finally gotten around to having reglazed in March. The federal matter, Belle said without planning to. He set down his fork. She had not raised this since December. She had made the decision she had made, and she had lived with it, and she had not used it as something to hold over the relationship. But she had been thinking about tonight, and the thinking had become the kind of thinking that needed to become words. Tell me what it actually looks like day to day, she said. Not the legal summary. What it feels like to live with. He looked at the table. Like a sound you can't quite hear, he said. You know it's there because you can feel it in your teeth. Most days you stop noticing. He looked at her. Some days you notice. What makes it a noticing day? Specific names in specific contexts. A conversation that moves in a direction that tells you the investigation has moved with it. He paused. Of awareness that people in my position do not get to stop being people in my position. The work compounds. You don't exit it by deciding to. Belle looked at him. Do you want to? She said. He looked at her for a long time. Parts of it, he said. Parts of it I'd hand to someone else tomorrow. Other parts stopped. Restarted. I built something. A lot of people's livelihoods are connected to the decisions I make. That's not something you put down cleanly. No, she said. It's not. You're not asking me to, he said. It was not quite a question. I'm asking you what's real, she said, because the part of this that's mine to navigate is only as large as what I actually know. If I don't know something, I can't navigate it. He looked at her with the full attention that was his most honest mode. There is one thing, he said. She waited. The man you saw in the corridor, he said. The first time you came to the Seaport office. The one who... I remember, his name is Dara. He has been with my organization for 11 years. He paused, choosing words with the care of someone who had thought about how to have this conversation. The parts of the operation that do not appear in the quarterly reports. He is exceptionally good at what he does. He is also under a separate federal investigation that may or may not intersect with mine. Belle looked at him. And I am telling you this because 3 weeks ago a federal agent made contact with my legal team and indicated they believe Dara is a more accessible path to the larger organization than I am, which means that within the next 6 to 12 months, the investigation may become less abstract. The May evening was quiet around them. Belle breathed in. Out. What does your legal team say? That the government's case is circumstantial and that the separation between Dara's activities and mine is documentable. He looked at the table. They believe the exposure is manageable. I believe them because they are very good and because they have managed this for 4 years and because the alternative to believing them is not useful. But it's not certain. No, it's not certain. Belle looked at the food on the table between them. She thought about the threshold pendant, bought by a woman who had stood in front of it for 20 minutes and decided the figure was going in. She thought about the ring, the imperfect ring, fault line of gold through silver, which was on Ronan's right hand, which was where he had put it on the night of the gala and where it had been every day since. She thought about what it meant to make a choice with full information. Full information was not comfortable. Full information was real. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay, she said again. You've told me. I know. I'm not leaving. And I'm not pretending this isn't what it is. She looked at him steadily. But Ronan, if the moment comes, if something shifts and the exposure becomes imminent, and you need to tell me to step back from proximity to you, I need you to tell me that directly. Not manage it. Tell me, yes, he said, and I'll make my own decision about what to do with it. I know. You're not going to manage that decision for me. I know that too. She looked at him across the consultation table in her studio. This man who was many things she had not expected, and some things she had gone into clearly, and had chosen anyway, and she thought that this specific conversation, this specific honesty, this willingness to sit across from each other with the uncomfortable real thing between them and not look away from it, was what she had been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. Not the absence of difficulty. The presence of someone who did not need to make the difficulty disappear. The wedding was in October. Belle had not planned it quickly. She had not planned it slowly. She had planned it at exactly the pace that felt right, which turned out to be approximately 11 months from the evening in the studio, with the takeout and the honest conversation about federal investigations. Anne, word okay, said twice. She wore ivory. The dress had been made by a designer she had met through the collection, a woman whose work had the same quality Belle's jewelry had, the quality of something that had been thought about rather than assembled. The dress was built around her body rather than in negotiation with it. Nothing was minimized. Nothing was redirected. The structure followed her actual structure, which was the only structure she had ever had. Corinne adjusted her veil in the small anteroom of the venue. The venue was not a church. It was a converted mill building in the Seaport district with exposed brick and large windows and the bones of something that had been built for work and had become, over time, something else. Belle had chosen it because she liked buildings with histories that were visible in the walls. How are you? Corinne said. Good, Belle said. Actually good. Not performing good. Corinne looked at her in the mirror. I know, she said. You look different than you looked at the Fairmont dinner. I was performing then. I know. Corinne smoothed the veil. I should have said something at the time. I saw it, and I didn't know how to. Corinne, I'm serious. You were managing your own situation, Belle said, which involved a man who had told you he loved you and asked you not to tell me, and you didn't tell him to disappear because you were trying not to hurt me, and then the whole thing detonated anyway. She looked at her sister in the mirror. We've talked about this. I know. Stop apologizing for something Tristan did. Belle turned from the mirror and faced her sister directly. He made those choices, you didn't. I didn't. He did. And then he spent a year trying to burn down what I built after it, and he failed, and now he's not here and we are. She looked at Corinne's face. This is the part where we're here. Corinne's eyes went bright. Don't cry, Belle said immediately. I have an hour of event left and I cannot manage your mascara right now. Corinne laughed and pressed the back of her hand to her eyes, and the crisis passed. The guests were what the guests were. Business leaders, foundation board members, clients of Belle's, architects and designers who had come into her professional life over the past year of the studio's expansion. Zone side was populated by men and women who carried themselves with the particular bearing of people who were accustomed to consequence, and the security presence around the venue was discreet in the way that only very competent security could be discreet, which to say you knew it was there but could not point to exactly where it was. Everett was there, near the back, with a woman he'd been seeing for 6 months, who had the relaxed quality of someone who did not need to perform for the room. He and Belle had spoken briefly in the fall, a clean, uncomplicated conversation over coffee, in which she had thanked him for his honesty at the gallery opening, and he had said that her honesty in return had been more useful to him than he'd expected, and that was the extent of the territory that needed covering. He caught her eye across the room as she came in and raised his glass. She nodded. It was enough. Ronan was at the front of the room. He was wearing the suit that was not trying too hard, which was the only kind he ever wore, and he was doing the thing she had watched him do in the corridor of the Seaport building over a year ago, occupying space differently than other people, without apparent effort. But when he saw her, the stillness changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was not the cinematic intake of breath. It was something smaller and more accurate, the look of a man who had spent 14 months learning the face in front of him and was finding, in this specific version of it, something he had not fully expected. Belle walked toward him the way she walked fully, without apology, at her own pace. She reached him. He looked at her for a moment before he spoke. "The dress," he said. "Yes. It's I know," she said. The ceremony was conducted by a judge Belle had met through a foundation board member, a woman in her 60s, with the composed warmth of someone who had presided over enough of these to understand what they actually required and what was decorative. The words were not elaborate. Belle had written her own portion, which was short, which had taken her 6 drafts to make short. She said, "I choose you with full information. I choose the difficulty and the uncertainty and the honest conversations and the things that are not simple. I'm not marrying the version of you that would be easier to explain. I'm marrying the one who sat across my workbench and told me the uncomfortable true thing, because I asked for it." Ronan's jaw moved. He had not expected those specific words. He collected himself. He said, "I spent most of my life in rooms where I was the most certain thing present. You are the first person who made me understand that being uncertain is not the same as being weak. You are also the first person who negotiated better terms on a contract I presented." He paused. "I intend to spend a significant amount of time being uncertain in your direction." A sound moved through the room. Not laughter. Something more like recognition. Belle looked at the ring on his right hand, the imperfect ring, the fault line of gold through silver, the piece she had made at 4 a.m. from an image she had woken with and had not fully understood until now. She had made it about choosing yourself. It was still about that. It was also, she understood now, about the moment after the moment when you had chosen yourself thoroughly enough that choosing someone else was not a contradiction, but a continuation. She reached across and touched the ring briefly with her fingertip. He felt it. She could see him feel it. Afterward, in the light from the large mill windows, with the reception moving around them and the October afternoon coming in gold and clean from the west, Ronan brought her a glass of water that she had not asked for but wanted, because after a year he had become fluent in the things she wanted without asking. She took it. "The worst engagement of my life," she said. He looked at her. "Introduced me to my husband," she said, "via his mother's necklace and a velvet box and 4 pages of contract terms." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not giving Tristan Fairmont credit for any of this," he said. Belle looked at him. "No," she said. "It was your mother." Something moved through his face. He looked out the window briefly, just a moment, just the reflex of a man allowing something to arrive that he hadn't steeled himself against. "Yes," he said. "It was." Belle touched his arm. He looked back at her. "She was right about you," he said. "The jewelry girl who fixes things like they matter." "I'm not a girl," Belle said. "No," he said. "You are considerably more than that." He extended his hand toward her, then, not taking hers, not pulling her anywhere, just opening his palm in the space between them. She looked at it. She thought about the conversation in the anteroom, and Corinne's almost tears, and the dress built around her actual body, and the 12 pieces sold in one evening, and Marcus in the expanded studio developing his own tool arrangement that bore no resemblance to hers, and the threshold pendant in the entrance of a house a woman had bought for herself. She thought about 6 years of a man. She thought about 6 to be uncertain about her own worth, and 11 months of a man who had been uncertain in her direction and had not found it shameful. She placed her hand into his. His fingers closed. They stayed there in the October light, in the building, with bones that showed, in the middle of a day that had been a year in arriving, and was now, quietly and completely, here in Belle Winslow, who had once believed that love meant being chosen over someone else, who had learned at a dinner table that the belief could be weaponized, who had spent 11 months building back the version of herself that didn't need anyone's approval to measure her own worth, stood in the room she had chosen, with the person she had chosen, and felt the specific satisfaction of someone who had gotten the important thing right. Not the happiness that was weather, the satisfaction that was structural. The door that was open because she had walked through it herself.